We have to recognize that it's not even a matter of optimism or pessimism, but to have hope is to actually is actually a state of mind. It's this recognition that things can change, whether we think they will or not. There's this possibility to recognize that the actions we take are actually part of what makes that future. And then hope becomes not this idea, but it becomes a verb. That movement towards a flourishing future that is the most powerful drive, because we have to really be creating that future ourselves. And it's through our creating that future that future will end up happening.
Welcome to episode 21 of the Future is Beautiful podcast. I'm Amisha, your host for this adventure. Applications are now open for my Presence mentoring program, which will start on August the 1st. This is for you if you need support to anchor inner shifts, new patterns, and ancient wisdom into your daily life. This 6-month leadership journey is a powerful one-to-one program designed to assist you in creating space to show up for yourself each day and to facilitate the formation of lifelong habits that will support and nurture your inner and outer connections. The program includes intuitive therapy, self-inquiry, and designing and committing to a daily practice that is right for you. The focus is on integration. You can take part from anywhere in the world, and it's priced to make it accessible. More information can be found at www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/events. My guest this week is Jeremy Lent. We met for the very first time as we came to sit down and have this conversation, after being told about each other by mutual friends. I was moved by the quality of his presence and depth. Jeremy is the author of Requiem of the Human Soul and The Patterning Instinct, a cultural history of humanity's search for meaning. He is founder of the non-profit Leeology Institute, dedicated to fostering an integrated worldview, both scientifically rigorous and intrinsically meaningful, that could enable humanity to thrive sustainably on the earth. He is currently working on his next book, provisionally entitled The Web of Meaning, an integration of modern science with traditional wisdom. But don't let all these big words scare you. He holds regular community workshops in the Bay Area to explore these topics through contemplative and embodied practices. In this conversation, we explore the world history of our separation from nature, the human instinct to bring meaning and pattern into life, and how we work with the emotions that arise from this so we can create a flourishing, beautiful, sustainable future. In this conversation, we explore the world history of our separation from nature, the human instinct to bring meaning and pattern into life, and how we work with the emotions that arise from this so we can create a flourishing, beautiful, sustainable future. I hope that you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I'm delighted today to be joined by author Jeremy Lent. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Misha. It's sort of wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you. I would like to kind of start with a little bit about your story and how you came to the body of work that we're going to be discussing later, The Patterning Instinct.
Yeah. Well, it's like a long sort of convoluted kind of story, in fact, because it's when I was kind of growing up, I would have believed I would have ended in this kind of place. But it wasn't like a straight line to come to this kind of place where I am at in my life right now, and the sort of place that wrote The Patterning Instinct and the other work that I'm doing. But I was in that sort of space when I was a student at Cambridge, and I just was railing against the establishment at that point. Like, I spent my last year or two there in a squat in Cambridge. This is back in 1980, 81. And as soon as I graduated, I left England to go to the States, because England felt to me like this kind of closed, narrow-minded society, like entrenched in the past, and then in Margaret Thatcher's England and all that stuff. And growing up in the 70s, I'd like seen these like images of Woodstock, and it just felt like to me, I've got to go to America. I've got to like discover something great. And of course, it was Reagan's America that I was landing in 1981. But I ended up actually being with somebody who became my first wife. She passed away some years back, but she'd been through the 60s and 70s, through the hippie space, and she'd actually traveled all over South America and spent years of her life with indigenous communities in Bolivia, Peru. And I was feeling like this was my sort of entree into this kind of place I wanted to discover, from having grown up in this kind of narrow-minded London world, is what I felt. But then we did this kind of detour because she had two stepsons. Well, they became my stepsons, and she and then we wanted to give them this kind of mainstream education. So I sort of detoured into this world where I got an MBA. And then from that, I started an internet company back in the days of the first internet kind of, the whole boom back in 1996, 99. I took the company public, and it was a success. And then my first wife, Molly, she got sick. I left the company to look after her too early. The company crashed. Then she went through years of really serious decline in health and kind of borderline dementia. Like, I really lost the person I'd loved. And so I just felt like my life had crashed around me. The things I'd built had crashed. And that was the beginning of the path of the last 10 years or so that led to this place I'm in now. I realized I could have a life. I could choose a life of meaning that was truly meaningful. But I wanted to make sure that whatever path I took was really meaningful for me. And what did that mean? And I started questioning all these things that we're told, that we take for granted, whether it's about soul or about transcendence or anything. I wanted to really get a sense, where do these ideas come from? So I started kind of peeling the onion, and I went on a kind of a cognitive journey, like understanding all this, and my own really embodied spiritual journey too, where I discovered things like meditation and yoga and traditional Chinese practices and other kind of practices that became really part of my life. Mm-hmm. And that's that journey, the last 10 years or so that I've been on.
So, sorry to hear about Molly. Before that part of your life, had you been interested in any of these things?
That's so interesting. When I was a student at Cambridge, I had some psychedelic experiences which profoundly kind of structured my sense of what reality was and could be about.
Was this in the squat?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in and around.
Or was this in a beautiful college?
Well, it's kind of all over, but walking when you're with some psychedelic experiences, just being in the world was, but yes, it was some, but all of the above sort of thing. But the thing is, I had no sort of understanding or tradition to relate that to. So I actually got this profound sense that love is what is really the greatest power in the universe. And I got this profound sense of our connectedness with all of nature. And it was so deep and so profound for me. But then, and that was what led me to want to go to California. That was the sense, like, I've got to really discover what this means. But I had no idea, I had no knowledge of, say, Buddhist practices and other of the great traditions of the world that had been there. I just knew that there was so much more than what I'd been grown up to and been sort of told was there. But then in this detour, everything was like in abeyance. All those years, I knew there was so much more, but I knew that I was not living it. And so that was really part of this kind of search for meaning that I began like about 10 or so years ago, was to understand what was those things that I knew all my life. I knew there was so much more than what we were told in mainstream culture, but I didn't know what that was. And the thing is, what was so interesting is that I'd read a lot of, scientific stuff, like the Richard Dawkins, and trying to understand, well, what is this world about? And you'd get to this reductionism, like, the more we know about the universe, the more meaningless it appears, and we're nothing but this. And I just knew in my heart, that's just not true. But my whole approach was I didn't just want to kind of reject it and as an act of faith go into that place. I wanted to really be able to integrate all of these different domains of knowledge. I wanted to integrate my intellectual understanding with what I truly knew and felt in my being was true. And that was what a lot of this journey was about for me, to make sense of that all and to put that together.
And were you still grieving through that process, or did you kind of have a sense of a period of grieving and coming to terms with death, and then went on this journey? I'm quite fascinated about death because I feel like it's something we don't talk about enough.
That is, such a deep question. And when I went through this period with Molly, my first wife, of it was about 7 or so years when she kind of went through this cognitive decline, and I really lost the person that I had deeply loved for a big chunk of my life. It was my only, up till that time, my only real deep love in my life. And so I grieved, and I grieved terribly year after year while she was still alive. So it ended up that the person I was caring for and going through the very, very difficult times, because there were a lot of personality disorder stuff going on too. And going through that time, I'd already lost the person that I loved, and I was with somebody that I had deep compassion and care for and wanted to reduce her suffering. And so it was this almost like a purgatory time. And what was interesting is that was when I first discovered meditation and Buddhism. And as I got deeper into that, I used to feel like at that time, I can't even go into the detail of how difficult this life was, but it was very, very separate. We were just kind of there with lost a lot of connections with community and society, and just incredible trauma, emotional and physical, all kinds of stuff. And when these things would be going on, I'd be feeling to myself, what would the Buddha do in this place? And it allowed me, it was almost like trial by fire. As I was discovering these kind of depths of what was possible from a spiritual place, I was like right there experiencing the greatest testing and challenges of those discoveries day by day. And I think that was one of those amazing things that I could look back now and feel deep gratitude for this time that really, I think, allowed me to experience maybe a far deeper embodiment of some of these realizations than would have been available if life was just kind of more tranquil and simple.
It is such an important role, the carer, and so many people find themselves in that situation. And as you said, it can be very isolating.
Yes.
What wisdom or comfort could you offer to any of our friends listening who are in that position?
Thank you for asking that question. That is so important. And I think that a couple of things came to my mind that really emerged through years of this place I was in. And the first is that you have to care for yourself as well as the other person who you are looking after, who you're caring for. That it's only through really offering compassion, care, and real and practices for well-being for yourself that you can really offer that in the best way to that other person. That can be all kinds of things like mental health, physical health, looking after yourself, basically. So that's one thing of extreme importance, because oftentimes the carer gets so drawn apart that they're just falling apart. And that leads to the other thing, because there's this great amount of guilt that comes when you're caring for somebody, for a loved one who themselves has got the more obvious ailments that you're caring for. You can easily fall into this place of guilt of anything you do that is not for that person, like you feel, I should be doing that. And the deepest guilt, the guilt that people really don't like to talk about, are these places like in the extreme, where there might be places in you where you just wish the other person would just be gone. How could I even have that sense for this person I love? And those are things that sometimes you can't even admit to yourself, never mind tell people who are close to you. Maybe if you're fortunate, you've got maybe a therapist or a friend that you can share those things to. But the important thing is to be able to hold all of that with kindness, to not compartmentalize, to integrate that, and to recognize that all these different parts of us, and if you have these feelings that feel so opposed to what you know that you're really about, not to feel guilt, not to feel like there's something terrible there, but to hold all that and just really hold that in love and compassion, and to integrate that, and to recognize that's not there's no ethical quality to our feelings and all the voices within us. The ethics arise from the actions we take. So that's the really, really deep lesson that I think I'd love to offer to anyone who's in that very extreme place.
Guilt is such a tricky one,
Yeah.
as is meeting those parts of ourselves that, don't fit in with our image of being a nice,
Right.
kind, loving person.
Exactly.
And actually, when you get down to it, I mean, carers, parents, children, I mean, a lot of part lovers, a lot of people have these feelings sometimes of like, I can't do this,
Exactly.
And it's part of the human condition, actually.
That is what it is, that we all have those parts of us that that are difficult to be with. And, I actually think that is one of the difficult I've seen on a lot of different spiritual paths that people find themselves on, where they get so focused on some sort of goal of where they are meant to be, that they actually end up with more dukkha, more suffering, as a result of that path they think they should be on than they need to be. Because I think a lot of the time, many spiritual teachers and many spiritual traditions put up really an unrealistic sense of what it is to be enlightened, or what it is to be in some place that is better than you are now. And they actually exacerbate self-loathing or frustration with the self, all these things that are, in my view, not only not necessary, but actually can prevent the path that can lead to a true place of unconditional love for oneself and for others around.
Well, it's actually quite dangerous, because if you're constantly, so I'm angry, and what is this anger mirroring, and and you have to go on all these processes constantly for all of your feelings, which a lot of, or if you haven't got this, it's because something's blocking your ability to manifest this, and I don't feel like the world actually works like that.
Right.
And different things fall into different people's lives, and there are so many factors, be it privilege, be it like where you're born, how you're born. If you believe in karma, there's all kinds of aspects to why someone might have something and someone might not. So the simplicity of some of the spiritual ways of saying, well, you can just manifest this, or you can just,
Yes.
clear this block and you'll be able to get this. It's something that I feel, having been in the spiritual world for a long time, is actually quite dangerous. And
Yes.
and when you were talking about your guilt and holding it, I just really felt you, and I felt me, and I felt my guilt, and there is guilt, and there's a lot of pain in the world, and there is anger, because there's a lot to be angry about.
Yes.
And so when we can welcome those parts of us, hold them, accept them, then they become part of our strength in the world, of who we are.
That is so right. And in fact, I'd go even beyond accepting them and actually really nurturing and loving them. And it's through those parts being loved that they can end up dissolving, because you can essentially dissolve them with kindness. And a big part of my own personal practice and what I teach through my own Leeology Workshops is the importance of kindness, as I think a kind of an underrated attribute of a true deep spiritual path, because it's through kindness. Like sometimes you can think of those deeper unintegrated parts of us. I like to think of it almost like, imagine like a little animal hiding, burrowing below the ground, scared to be seen, and it sort of pops its head up every now and then. And if you can offer it kindness, then as time goes on, it actually begins to go, oh, okay, it's kind of safe to be seen a little bit more. And so, but through kindness, you can build trust within yourself. Those different parts of you can feel they can come up without causing this whole disruption within the self. And by doing that, as time goes on, that they can be seen more, they can be embraced. And that doesn't mean that if you have a feeling of anger or a feeling of hate for a person or something like that, embracing that doesn't mean that you say, yes, I'm going to act on that. Quite the contrary. You look at what were the underlying hurts, what were the underlying deepest conditionings that caused that in the first place, and then recognize that all those difficult parts of us at some point were maybe at very, very early points in our life, some sort of defense for the self, like to try to protect the self against hurt and against harm. And by recognizing that and treating them almost like little children, because oftentimes that's where they began, you can begin to allow them to feel integrated. And the more integrated they become, the more they lose their charge, and they just become part of the fuller sense of who you are. Because in a sense, you cannot love yourself unconditionally without loving every part of yourself, including all those other parts that might be the ones hidden deep down.
Beautiful. You mentioned Leeology. Can you tell us what that means?
Yes, sure. So Leeology is a word that I created myself, and it comes from the traditional Chinese word Li, which basically means like the organizing principles. And the word ology is like the study of, just like the Greek word. And Li means not just organizing principles of a certain thing. Li means the organizing principles of the universe. So in traditional Chinese cosmos, there was this understanding of qi being like all the energy and matter of the entire universe. And Li was the ways in which that energy and matter connected up to form everything, all that is that we know, life and every non-living stuff around us. So Leeology is it's like an embodied investigation into the organizing principles of the universe. And as such, the idea around it is it's integrating both traditional wisdom, that's what the Li represents, and also a deeply rigorous scientific understanding of those things. So a lot of what Leeology is about is this recognition of the integration of everything, the integration of traditional wisdom and modern science, the integration of reason and intellection with our embodied experience, the integration of mind and body. In fact, the recognition that there is no real distinction between those two, that those are false dualities. And the integration of also our spiritual path and engagement and action in the world. And so that's a lot of what Leeology is about, is kind of exploring what it means to live a truly integrated life.
Beautiful. And how do you explore it through your own work?
Yeah, what I've been doing for a few years now is holding series of Leeology workshops in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live. And those are usually workshops that, the workshops themselves embody that sense of integration. So we might take a theme, and maybe the theme might be, let's say there's this traditional Chinese concept of Wu Wei, which means like sort of effortless action. And so I might explore, explain some of this theme, what it means from the traditional Chinese point of view, and then offer like maybe guided meditations, and then offer some Qigong or other traditional Chinese embodied practices to feel into that. And then look at that from a scientific perspective, like looking at the cognitive neuroscience of what that means. And then often include dance as well as discussion. So all the different aspects of how we are as human beings can then sort of get integrated into this one exploration of a particular theme. And so that's the kind of the way it goes. So each time is a different theme explored in that kind of way.
So can you break that theme down a little bit more? Because I'm curious of what is the scientific cognitive.
Oh, you mean of Wu Wei itself?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, totally. Well, so Wu Wei is this notion of effortless action. And sometimes there's this kind of word that has oftentimes gets really used a lot nowadays, this kind of concept of flow, this sense of like what it means to be in flow. And what's so interesting about this notion is that to get into flow, somehow we have to work hard at it. So imagine, say, like somebody who's riding a bicycle and they're just kind of, they're totally in flow. They're not even aware of what they're doing. They're just doing this embodied movement. But there was a time when they were stumbling and they were falling off their bikes when they were a little kid, learning how to do it. So this whole notion about Wu Wei is this kind of paradox that you have to work at something in order to get to that place of effortlessness. And the other way of looking at it from a neuroscience point of view, and this is something I go into in quite a lot of my work, is this recognition that as humans, we have this way of being not in Wu Wei. It's like the Chinese actually had this word Yu Wei, which meant sort of effortful action. And in a way, that's what actually separates humans from other creatures around us. So there's this idea that other creatures, they act in Wu Wei, like your cat, or just even the plants right here, and it's doing its thing. It's not trying to figure out what am I meant to do to be a plant. It does its thing, and it's in the fullness of what it is. But as humans, we have this separating cognitive structures through our prefrontal cortex, that allows us to think symbolically. It's allowed us to do everything that defines humanity, like language, culture, civilization, technology, all this stuff. And it separates us from our Wu Wei experience, from the natural world. So the question then becomes, how can we be one or the other? We can't give up our humanity. We can't just sort of say, okay, I'm just going to just really be this kind of non-human entity and just be in total Wu Wei. But is there a way to go through that place of conceptual to this more effortless place? And what does that actually mean to be human and to be in Wu Wei at the same time? So that's the kind of deep exploration of what that's about.
Beautiful, and that sort of leads us into the partner instinct.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
And the work that you've done there. So during those 10 years whilst you were in your personal journey, you were also very much researching patterns on a wider scale of humanity throughout time.
Right. Yes, exactly. So we've been describing, well, to some degree, sort of touching on to some of these, my own personal kind of spiritual growth and path through that. And at the same time, I was going through this kind of layering of where do these ideas come from that we're told this is what the world is about. And it it was a little bit like sort of peeling an onion. I kept trying to go deeper and deeper, deeper into the past, deeper into our senses of what makes us human to find these things out. And as I started doing that, I made some discoveries. I sort of realized that a lot of what we just take for granted in our ideas now in the modern Western or global worldview, whatever, they come from a lot of Christian ideas, which then in turn come from ancient Greek ideas. And I realized that actually when you go deeper back, you look at indigenous cultures, agrarian civilizations, and then other cultures like traditional China or India, there's totally different ways of making sense of the world. And then I went even sort of deeper to like look at, well, what is it about humans that actually cause these different ways of making sense to be there in the first place? And that's what I did a lot of reading and research into what's called cognitive science or cognitive anthropology, looking at these questions of what it is that makes us human. And what I realized at some point is that we have an instinct as humans to pattern meaning into the cosmos. And the other animals also have that instinct. I mean, the brain itself, the mammalian brain itself, is like a patterning kind of organism, essentially. But the human brain does it to a whole degree greater than any other mammal, as far as we know. And what that means is, it's an instinct, because just a brand newborn baby who's born into the world, nobody tells her, you should learn language. And yet, as the months go by, she hears these sounds, she associates it with touch and feeling, and she begins to put this together. And and that's her instinct. As she puts it together, she begins to practice words, and she uses that to learn language. And you can imagine when humans first developed language, maybe 100,000 years ago or so, they would have looked at this like sort of random seeming sense of what was going on and tried to make sense of it using this drive to pattern meaning that basically the prefrontal cortex, this humanly developed, uniquely developed part of the brain, drives us to do. And so that's where they develop things like what I call a mythic consciousness, like trying to make sense out of things. And as they did so, the way in which we make sense out of things, it's so fascinating. It's we use these core metaphors. So all of our abstract thinking, our conceptual ideas, they're all based ultimately on our embodied experience. That's something that a cognitive linguist called George Lakoff in California really developed this understanding in the last couple of decades, and there's now like a whole sort of sub-discipline looking at this understanding. But just imagine things like ideas like up or down, that's a physical experience. But we say things like feel up today, or if I say you just gave me a warm smile. Well, you didn't actually give me anything. You didn't like take something and hand it to me. But I'm using that embodied experience to create this metaphor of giving. Mm-hmm. And the smile you gave me wasn't actually warm. I mean, the radiation didn't sort of bring up my temperature. But I'm using that as a metaphor. And that's all of our conceptual thinking is based on this embodied scaffolding. And that's a fascinating part of understanding how that patterning instinct works.
What does patterning mean in this context?
Yeah. Well, basically, what patterning is really about in my mind is it's this way of looking at what would otherwise be a random or undifferentiated set of things and piecing some things together so that some parts of it get to be more meaningful and other parts of it get kind of ignored or left out. So it's like, as our human way of cognition, we have to ignore things as much as we have to focus on what we're choosing to focus on. So imagine looking up at the sky as an early hunter-gatherer at the dawn of human consciousness, looking at the stars, and they'd form constellations. They say, oh, see that star, that forms Apollo or something, right? And that star, and so they pattern a meaning into one set of stars and then sort of begin to ignore the ones that don't seem as important.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we do when we pattern meaning into our lives. We look at what is important, we notice the things that fit into that framework, and we kind of ignore the stuff that's not in that framework. And we have to do that, but being aware of that is so important, because then that allows us to recognize some of the frames that we're actually in, and allows us to kind of grow and not be trapped by our own culture's worldview that can be so powerful that we only get to see the stuff that worldview is patterned into its meaning.
How do we balance having an openness to our framework so that we're not stuck in a certain way of thinking and being and noticing that we've inherited culturally or politically, without being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of different patterns we could be taking into our framework?
Yes, what a beautiful question.
Everyone's allowed to not know the answers to questions.
No, I love that.
On this,
I know, I love that. I think, but let me just ponder that for a moment, because it can be so overwhelming to kind of just reject. I mean, sometimes there's this notion of if you just kind of break out of a framework you're in and you don't have some alternative framework to put into its place, it can be terrifying, and it can feel liberating, but it can also feel like chaotic, and it can be an awful experience in many ways. And I think that, in a sense, it comes back maybe a little bit to that notion of kindness we were talking about before, that we all begin with a particular framework. And so I think a path to growth that might be the most sustainable, that really leads to true flourishing, might be one where we kind of incorporate things and we kind of add things to the framework we're in. And then we might come to a place. It's a little bit like there's this notion of emergence in complex systems, or phase transitions, when one pattern that has been working and begins to sort of unravel a little bit, and then it can shift to a new pattern, like a new sort of stable way of making sense. But that shift itself can be a period of chaos and feel frightening. But then it can re-stabilize into a new way of being. And I think that one way in which to experience that is to not just throw out what you have until you've begun to form some sense of something else that's possible. And then I think when that does happen, your being, you need to trust in your overall being, trust in the wisdom of your overall consciousness as an organized system, to know when the time is to sort of go from that one place to another. And I think that that's the most important thing, probably, is to trust in yourself, and that deep part of yourself, like a true inner wisdom, which I think that we all have, that we can be in touch with when we do get to that place of a more unconditional love for ourselves.
And also be aware that when one pattern's fading in that space before another pattern has formed, that we are vulnerable and we're a little bit weak without a solid framework. So it's really a time to be very nurturing to ourselves.
It's true. It's a time to be nurturing to ourselves. And it can be a vulnerable time, because oftentimes that's when teachers who have a lot of charisma, like a sort of a guru type, a strong personality teacher, can actually take hold of people. Like oftentimes people get to a place of realizing that we live in this culture with so much that's screwed up and so much that's wrong. And they want to reject that, and they want to reject those things that their life has been sort of constrained by. But when you go into that place of unknowing, it can be terrifying. And then you can have a strong teacher who just looks like he or she just really knows their stuff, and goes, trust me, like I've got the answer, like here's the structure, here's the meaning, here's what it's all about, here's the practices. And that leads to a lot of the kind of cults and just other really strong, powerful forces that feel comfortable, because then you go, okay, I've got the answer now. But then it can often lead to a kind of a false path and lead to a lot more suffering and difficulty as time goes on. So there's the need for really being with oneself. And when one feels doubts arising, back to that part I was saying before, not just ignoring those doubts, not sort of starting to compartmentalize, like, I got to trust what that new guru is telling me, but like when you have the doubts, really feel them, don't reject them, be with them, and love all the different parts of yourself, because that's where you're not going to go wrong. If you offer yourself true kindness and true love, you'll find yourself on the path, on the right path.
And it's not just the kind of personal journey, the cult leaders, because this is also when politicians, when political parties, when corporations, when media channels can also come into that space and take it and offer an easy advantage.
Exactly.
And that's where some of the issues that we're facing at the moment,
That's so
Brexit,
true.
Trump, the sustainability and ecological crisis,
Right.
that these things can kind of come in because there is a sense that where we are isn't quite working, that people are unsatisfied, and then there's also a kind of fear around the planet and what's happening there, and so then there's a lot of space where there aren't very clear solutions, and so anyone that's saying they have a solution becomes even more attractive and appealing.
Yes, I think that's so true. And a lot of what my book, The Patterning Instinct, is about is looking at how we got to this place, this modern worldview that is basically is all a lot about consumerism, led by these massive transnational corporations that are basically devouring the earth, using that by essentially filling, or not filling, but papering over this total gap of meaning that people have in their lives, this sense of emptiness that people have, that's arisen from the worldview that over the last few centuries has begun to dominate our world. Essentially, what this worldview tells us is that everything is ultimately meaningless. So if you want to, you can either sort of pray to some transcendent God up there, or not. But this material world we live in has no meaning, and so if you want meaning, just get it out of the short-term gain from this particular consumer product, or feel good by doing this particular thing. What's I call in the book, it's not my own term, it's from other, but it's called the hedonic treadmill. Like, so you get on this hedonic treadmill, and once you're on it, you just got to keep running and keep buying and keep working hard to be able to afford that, to remain on it, and basically get nowhere fast. Yeah, and I think that's the basis of our consumer-oriented world right now.
Can you give us a condensed, brief history?
Yeah, sure.
I know you're going to have to miss out some bits,
I know,
how we got here.
Yeah, it's. I know it's interesting. How do you give the sort of history of the world in 5 minutes? And it's essentially one way of looking at it from those hunter-gatherer times to the present day is different stages of separation, having talked with Charles Eisenstein, you'll hear a lot of things that relate, because our work has a lot of parallel understandings of that, and he focuses a lot on separation, and I think that's my sense of how we can see things. So you can look at almost like there's 4 or so stages of separation that I see. And the first, really, the very first one just comes from what we talked about earlier, human evolution, and the development of language, and our own prefrontal cortex mediated cognition that causes that first stage of separation from Wu Wei to Yu Wei, as the Chinese call it, to like separateness from the world. So that's kind of stage one. But then as hunter-gatherers, humans spent 95% of our history feeling totally connected with the world. As nomadic hunter-gatherers, their sort of core embodied metaphor of the world was nature as a giving mother and father, a giving parent. They had an intimate relationship with the spirits everywhere around them. And there wasn't much sense of anxiety or much sense of anything would go that wrong, because they were just part of the world. And the next level of separation really arose with agriculture about 12,000 years ago. And oftentimes when I'm presenting these things, I show an image of a fence, because the fence is this iconic symbol of agriculture, like fencing out the wilds for your cultivated fields, but then also fencing out other humans from your work. And you get really the rise of so many of the things that we think are just human nature, that we take for granted, really only arose the last 12,000 years, like hierarchy and the sense of property and the sense of ownership. And that's really when the patriarchy began. And this just the idea of wealth began. All these things began with agriculture. And those ideas led to this kind of new world view of the gods as being almost like a hierarchy of the gods. So you'd have to worship them. Hunter-gatherers would just chat with the gods. As they walk in the forest, they'd say, hey, yeah, here's our new kid. Like, it was intimate. But now you had priests had to mediate. You had to sacrifice to the gods. You had rituals. So just like you were working hard in the field, you had to work hard in order to get your reward. And disasters could come if you got unlucky. So similarly, you'd have to really pray and worship those gods and tell them how great they were. Otherwise, they would send the disasters down on you. So this kind of anxiety grew up along with that. So that was next stage. But then another stage of separation happened actually in one place in history with the ancient Greeks. And this was what started Western thought on a unique path, different from any other civilization anywhere. And that was when Plato especially, but people around him, got to look at the world as not just being these sort of, there are spirits up further up in the heavens, but they kind of created this notion of a split cosmos, where there was this perfect eternal dimension of the universe, where some sort of godlike creator was, and where there was like ideal eternal goodness. And then you had this material world where everything changed and was polluted and things died. And similarly, they split their sense of what it is to be human to a soul and a body. And the soul was divine and linked us with that perfection. And the soul was imprisoned in this horrible body. And when the body died, it actually liberated the soul to go back to that perfection again. So they started to live this split life. So another sense of separation began there. And that led, actually Christianity inherited that. And through, actually, we think of Christianity as being, nowadays, being like sort of the enemy of science, religion versus science. But actually, in its first 1,000 years, Christianity actually incubated this scientific thought, because people thought their reason, their rationality put them in touch with that goodness, with that God, was separate from emotion. So the early scientific the people of the scientific revolution, Newton, Descartes, Galileo, all these people, they were devoutly religious. They thought they were discovering the mind of God in their science, which led to this next amazing separation from our scientific revolution of a few hundred years ago to the present day, where there was these notions developed that not just humans being separate from nature, but nature actually had no intrinsic value of its own. Nature was a machine, and you could use your reason to understand every element about it. And in fact, this idea developed, led by somebody called Francis Bacon back in the 17th century. We've got to conquer nature. We actually, it's not just sort of different, it's almost like this enemy to conquer. And those are the ideas that actually led to a lot of the things we can be grateful for right now. The technology that we all rely on, and greater understanding of health, and many of the benefits of civilization, because it led to this deep sort of, the word science itself actually comes from the word meaning to sort of cut. So it's like this deep cutting of looking at things, separating them out. But it led to this kind of darker alienation, and it led to a lot of the imbalances that we're experiencing right now in the world, where there's still the fundamental ways in which our mainstream world looks at nature is as a machine. And as technology has the solution to everything, as if that same conquering nature idea is still paramount.
Mm. Where did these first conquering ideas actually come from? Did somebody just wake up one day and go, oh, like...
Yeah, well, there was really a tradition in an early there was a kind of a sense in ancient Greek thought of humans using their reason could discover things. But there wasn't so much this sense of conquering. And that actually was really a new metaphor that arose with the development of some of the sort of power of scientific investigation. So the idea of science as a machine, the idea of the world as a machine, was something that actually you can trace that all the way back to the Old Testament. Even there was a sense that God was up here and he sort of set parameters, and the world was almost like what God decided to tell it to do. But this notion of conquering actually came about a little bit as though there was the sense through the medieval times that after the fall, like sort of humans had dominion over nature, but then Adam and Eve did their bad stuff and they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and humans have never been able to sort of regain dominion since then. And there was quite literally, back in those days, Francis Bacon and others actually looked at science as being essentially the way for humans to regain the dominion that they lost when they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And back in those days, that wasn't just some sort of interesting story. They actually believed that had actually happened in history. They viewed that as a historical event. So they got to see science as sort of giving humans this dominion back. But I actually think that actual metaphor of conquering nature was really new in the 17th century. Nobody had ever conceived of nature like that before. And you see, in traditional China, they had all kinds of advanced technology, but they never even conceived of this notion of conquering nature. Technology is something you use to kind of harmonize more with nature or give yourself a more comfortable life within certain parameters. But there was no notion of separation from nature and therefore trying to conquer it.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, I have to say thank you for giving us this tour of world history in just a few minutes. Where does that leave us now?
Well, we are on a path of ever faster change right now in the world that we're in, and we're in a very, very unstable path. And I actually finish my book. The last chapter of The Patterning Instinct looks at the different scenarios as to where we're headed, as where we might be headed in our world. And we're in this place where we're consuming the earth at totally unsustainable rates. And there's one very reasonable set of arguments that lead to this belief that our whole civilization is on the path of collapse unless we do something very, very dramatically different in where we're going. Because, I mean, right now we're consuming the earth at 3 times the sustainable path. We're essentially, if there were 3 earths, we'd be kind of sustainable. And we're looking at growth in our global economy triple what it is now by the middle of this century. So that something has to give. And the risk of a real collapse is a terrifying and very real possibility we need to be aware of. But I think that there's another possibility that is equally terrifying for most of humanity, and morally maybe even worse, is this notion of what I call a techno-split. I describe it as like essentially a bifurcation of humanity, where the more affluent minority of humans they put barricades around themselves, they enjoy their technology, even genetically enhance themselves, and at some point even bifurcate as a race from the rest of humanity who are left dealing with the total catastrophe of climate change and environmental devastation. And the reason I feel that that is a massive moral burden for us to look at and to recognize is I think a lot of the wealthy, powerful elites don't do what they should be doing about climate breakdown and other things because they go, well, it'll be okay for us and our family, we'll look after ourselves. And that's where I feel we have to recognize that as a shared humanity, we have the responsibility to do what needs to be done to not allow that kind of split in humanity that I see really happening right now in these incredible divides in global inequality. Where, like right now, it's hard to believe, but the wealthiest 6 men in the world own as much wealth as the entire lower half of the world's population. The most unbelievable inequality that has ever existed in human history. And I do believe that there's a possibility for a third path. And that third path could actually lead us to a flourishing future for humanity and for humanity on the earth, for the natural world. But that path involves a transformation of our economic system that's taken us to this place. So it involves moving away from these stages of separation to an understanding of connectedness within ourselves, with community, with the natural world, and living our lives in that way, and moving from that place to demanding that from our politicians, to building that within ourselves, in our communities. And I think so much of that is going on right now, but we need to be really deeply connected with what others around us who are looking at the world in that way are doing in order to enable that transformation to take place.
I mean, I have now some pessimism present in myself.
Yeah.
And I think when you're talking about, this kind of new world that the elite might create, and I'm thinking, I mean, we can't even distribute food evenly to human beings on this planet. And, in some cases, the food is actually growing very physically close to the people that can't get it.
Yes.
It's completely nuts what we've done. And if we can't do it with something as simple as food, there are nations that grow bananas and don't get bananas.
Right.
How can we do it with something as big as this ecological crisis that we're in?
Yes. I think that when we look at the causes for those criminally inhumane things that you're just describing there, where the very land that the people should be using to grow their own crops to live on, they're using to grow those bananas to export to the affluent world, and they're barely dying of starvation. And we have to recognize that these things have come from the global economic system that the Europe originally, and then the West, imposed on the rest of the world. And they've used violence and brutality and political oppression and then economic oppression to persist in those things. And I think what we need to realize right now is these global transnational corporations are far more powerful than most nation states. If you look at the top 100 economies in the world right now, 69 of them are transnational corporations rather than actual nation states. They basically have this stranglehold on the world, and their whole raison d'etre is to increase shareholder value, essentially consume the earth and monetize human experience to make more money for the billionaires and for the wealthy. And I've really come to believe that the most important thing that we can do is recognize that and really start some really global grassroots movements to put some limits on the power of those corporations to have that kind of power to destroy our humanity, to destroy life. Mm-hmm. And those things can be done. It's a matter of getting people aware of what's going on and getting enough connectivity around throughout the world to force our politicians to recognize that's what needs to be done, and we're not going to accept this kind of destruction of our humanity going forward.
Okay, so there's two more things that I want to do now, and the second is to focus on solutions and what we can all do. But before we go there, I want to acknowledge that, like, right now, I feel angry and sad and frustrated and pessimistic, as do many people that are listening, because it does invoke all of those things. So what we were talking about at the beginning of bringing those feelings and those parts of ourselves closer, I'd like us just to take a few moments to do that, and to, to bring all of that dissatisfaction, to honour it in ourselves.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for bringing that in to the conversation. And that is so, so true. And I also believe that a part of honoring that anger is to first recognize it and to have compassion for the incredible anguish that any of us feel when we look at the destruction going on, when we look at the climate catastrophe that we're causing, at the extinction of species, at so much devastation. And also some of the guilt that comes from those of us who are in the affluent world, of realizing that affluence, that takes a real leap of understanding. The very affluence that we're enjoying is actually actively resulting from that devastation that's being caused to others elsewhere, and recognizing that and being with that and having compassion for that. And then not staying there, but then moving that true integration of those feelings has to move to this recognition of us being part of this embedded web of life, this integrated web around us, and then shifting that towards action. Because to just be in that place and not to actually move that into action is, to my mind, a bypass, and is to actually be one of the people who is causing that devastation. Because once we wake up and get to that place, it drives us naturally to action. And so I think that's what any one of us who feels those things, it's too much of a luxury to get so pessimistic that we say, look, it's all screwed. There's nothing we can do about it. Those people who are truly suffering out there in the world, the billions of people, they don't have the option to even say that. They've just got to get on and deal with it each day. And we have to recognize that it's not even a matter of optimism or pessimism. There's a writer called Rebecca Solnit, who wrote a super book called Hope in the Dark, where she points out that either of those two, optimism or pessimism, are basically like cop-outs, one way or the other. But to have hope, the way that she's describing hope, is to actually is actually a state of mind. It's this recognition that things can change, whether we think they will or not. There's this possibility to recognize that the actions we take are actually part of what makes that future. And then hope becomes not this idea, but it becomes a verb. There's an environmentalist who talks about hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And that's a way to actually be with that anger, be with that sense of grief, and work with others in that. Not working alone, but sharing that with others and actually moving that towards making a difference. And we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if that difference is going to be enough. But we do know that we, each of us, have the ability to actually recognize and choose our actions based on that.
Okay, so we have our anger for all of the inequality, for what we can't do, for how our actions don't seem to be enough. We have our sadness for all of the needless suffering that we witness. And then our guilt, for those of us that know we're not doing enough, that actually know that a lot of our lives are quite silly, going for a latte and getting given it in a paper cup that was completely unnecessary, or driving our car, or our lives are so filled with things that are meaningless and that are paradoxical to that anger and that sadness.
Yeah.
And so let's all just take a moment to lovingly invite in that anger and that sadness and that guilt. And we could do this for a lot longer, but immediately I feel more available
Yes.
to solutions, to finding my place in
Yes.
what's possible in this story.
That is so true, Amisha. And like, one of the things that we can recognize there is that we can be kind to those places. We can have compassion with those places. And that compassion allows us to then move into action in a way that is so much more powerful.
So if we are to create a beautiful future, one of flourishing, of sustainable flourishing, how do you feel how do you feel our best kind of way towards that is, or the best use of our kind of individual energy?
Yeah. You know, something that has really struck me recently, you might be familiar with this concept, this idea that Joseph Campbell decades ago put out there, where he said, like, follow your bliss. And that was this powerful meme that sort of got going around the kind of hippie era or whatever. And we're in this world right now that we've just been describing. I think one of the most powerful things we can do is what somebody once described as follow your heartbreak. Because each of us, it hits each of us in different ways, you know? Some people might be devastated by what they see going around them in their community. Other people might be devastated by the whole global breakdown of climate. Like, one of the things that, for example, I find just breaks my heart is elephants and the destruction of these beautiful, profound, amazing creatures, and the fact they might even be looking at extinction. One of the most unbelievable, incredible species that this earth ever held, we're just destroying with this brutality. I can hardly stand even just thinking about it. And that's what I mean by a heartbreak. But when we follow that, that's the thing that gets us up in the morning and says, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to make a difference about this. And that can propel you to all these amazing places. And I think the reason I feel that's so important is that this movement towards a transformation, it's not like there's one approach that's better than the others. There's choices of working in community, moving towards the future that we can create with ourselves in community. There's political engagement. There's deep spiritual exploration. There's ways of learning how to be with each other in ways that allow more connectivity. But each of these ways is like an ecosystem. And an ecosystem works best when each of the different parts are doing what it does best in relation to everything else. So from that, I feel the best thing we can do is follow that heartbreak, follow what we really care about the most, and at the same time, recognize we are just one little part of this interconnected web of a transformational ecosystem. And as such, we should be focusing a lot of energy, not just on what we can do to be effective, but how each of us can make others effective around us. So whenever we're looking at other groups, other people, looking at what they're doing, to really get outside of ourselves, to realize our identity can be expanded to incorporate all those people and go, how can I help that person accomplish what they're doing, which is part of this movement towards transformation.
I love that. It's kind of like the flip side of what we did with The Future is Beautiful, the Think Out Vote that this podcast came out of, which was asking people, what's the future you choose? So using vision to find out what your values are, but equally heartbreak also gets you to the same place, or maybe you can do both.
Exactly.
And find where your heartbreak and your vision come together.
Exactly. Because I do feel, having said that part about following the heartbreak, it's that movement towards a flourishing future that is the most powerful drive, because we have to really be creating that future ourselves. And it's through our creating that future that future will end up happening. And so it's very much a sense of that it's possible, that we can do it, and that we have that within ourselves, and that, you know, through our own connections with each other, we can create little microcosms of that future. That as those different microcosms get to connect up with each other, all of a sudden it can go through one of these phase transitions we talked about before, and it can actually, suddenly we realize it's actually becoming that future.
We are the future.
Yes.
And the present.
We are.
And the past. Thank you so much. It feels like we've reached the end of our exploration for today.
Great conversation. Thank you so much for holding the space here. Yeah.
Thank you. I feel like something has shifted inside of me through talking to you, and I that's why I'm doing this podcast, because it's the ability to be exposed to different people's journeys and thinking and processes. It really just opens up this space of connection where the separation can melt.
Yes, exactly. And that's what we can all do. And we all have that choice each day to just make those new connections that basically can recreate our world into the way it can be. Yeah.
Thank you for your time today and for your work.
Yeah.
And we'll post links to everything that we've mentioned. But your website is Jeremy Lent.
Yes, basically the two websites I have is jeremylent.com, which is really a lot about my book, The Patterning Instinct, and the themes around that. And then leeology.org is the other one. And I do have a blog, which is called Patterns of Meaning, which is at patternsofmeaning.com, where I post recent articles I write, things like that.
Brilliant.
Yeah, great.
Well, everyone check out more of Jeremy's work.
Well, thank you. And it's just been a great pleasure talking to you today. Thank you.
You too. Thank you. Thank you for listening. As always, you can find links to everything we mentioned in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our community. If you loved this and would like to contribute to our Patreon campaign or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on community. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes so we can grow. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together.